David Purpura, who is from Purdue University, an assistant professor there in the College of Health and Human Sciences. So David and I went to graduate school together, so I've known him for 10 years.
11.
Figured out 11 years.
11 years now.
Ah.
Right?
11 years.
Yeah. 10 and a half. Be more precise.
Somewhere in there. So about a decade. David's research work is working with kids in preschool and studying primarily their early math development. And well, we're very excited to have you today, and I will let you take it away.
Great, thanks. Well, thank you for having me today. I'm really excited to talk about what I do, mainly because I do it and I enjoy it. So it's great to talk about it with other people who want to hear it. So the title of my talk is From Assessment to Intervention, Non-Mathematical Factors Affecting Mathematical Development. The non-math factors that I'm mainly going to be talking about are language, are basic language skills, and specifically math language. And I'll get more into that in a little bit. But to give you an overview of what I'll be talking about, first I'm going to start with, I like to couch my research, or my presentations in what I do overall. So I'm going to give you a kind of broad scope of what my general research focus is and where this fits into that scope. Then I'll talk about some of the basics on early math. What is early math? Which aspects of it am I focusing on? Then there'll be 3 studies. The first one will be on a general developmental process of early math skills. The second one will be some targeted relations in terms of how 2 different non-math skills affect math development. And that one, actually Jessica's my co-author on that, so if you have any issues with it, you can talk to her. And then the last one is my new math language intervention. I'm really excited about this. It's one that I really enjoyed the process both before, during, and after. So it's been a lot of fun. So I'm gonna, if we have time, I also have a brief video on that. So then I'll talk about some general conclusions and some future directions in terms of this research. I have questions at the very end, but feel free to interrupt at any time. It can be a broader scope question, or it could be something very specific to making something more clear. Feel free to interrupt me all the time. I have a 2 and a 4-year-old, or almost 4-year-old, so I'm really used to getting interrupted. Okay, it would actually be awkward if I wasn't interrupted. Okay, so in terms of my research focus, I have 3 main areas that I focus on. The first one is assessment development. Really underlying any good research program, I feel you have to have strong measurement, but also it's important that these measures be easy to use and easy to implement, and particularly brief to administer. So there's, I've developed both a single targeted broad measure of early math skills that takes less than 5 minutes to develop, to assess, which are actually being used by Sandy's group out here. And there's some more targeted measures of specific math aspects, and you'll see those throughout these 3 different studies. Second area is understanding both typical and atypical math development, how these skills develop, as well as what other skills affect this development. And then the third area is intervention, because all of this other information, if we can't ultimately determine how to intervene well and what to intervene on, for these young kids is somewhat useless, I like to say. I mean, ultimately, we want to improve educational outcomes, and so that's a third area of my focus. But all of these are designed with the intent to develop targeted and individualized assessment for young children, assessment and intervention for young children. Today, I'm going to be focusing on these 2 specific areas, some aspects of the development as well as intervention. So when we talk about early math skills, there are broadly 5 domains that you're talking about: numbers, operations, geometry, patterns, and measurement. If you look across any standards documents, regardless of the state, you're going to find these 5 areas. They may have different names depending on how different state committees decided to name them, but you'll generally find these 5 areas. My work primarily focuses on numeracy and operations. When we talk about numeracy and operations, you're generally talking about verbal counting, one-to-one correspondence, set comparison, cardinal number knowledge, subitizing that ability to rapidly enumerate small sets without actually counting. So if I hold up that many fingers, you know that that's 3. You didn't have to count that. The number order, knowing the order of numbers in that counting sequence, being able to identify numerals, and being able to connect those numerals to the actual quantities, as well as being able to solve story problems and more formal addition problems. So we know that early numeracy development is critical for the development of later math skills, as well as some research has found that early math skills are actually a very strong predictor of later literacy skills. And with these early math skills, in terms of their development, they're cumulative. Those foundational skills are necessary for the development of subsequent skills, and those are necessary for the development of the next stage of skills. Difficulties at any of those levels are likely to result in difficulties at the next stages. And really, in order to identify which children are likely to struggle later on in terms of math and how to intervene on these skills, we first need to understand how these early math skills develop, what order, what is this learning trajectory of skills. Second, what other skills affect this development, whether it's language skills, basic print skills, more advanced executive functioning type skills. We need to understand how and when those skills seem to impact math development. And then we also need to know how to effectively intervene on these skills. So here I'm going to talk about 3 interrelated studies. The first 2, the development of the model, and the second one, targeted relations of non-math skills. Those really fit into that assessment and development area of my work, and then the third one fits into the intervention area. So study 1. So we know that within certain skills, in terms of counting, children progress through what's called a learning trajectory. There's this general ordering of how early math skills develop. For example, with counting, children first have to learn that verbal counting sequence. Then they can apply it to a set where they can actually count out. So let me lay out these 3 pieces of paper. They can go 1, 2, 3. That doesn't actually mean that they understand that there are 3 pieces of paper. What it means is that they can apply that counting sequence correctly. There's that next step of cardinal number knowledge, understanding that the quantity actually means 3. Because without that cardinal understanding, many kids actually would say that if you go 1, 2, 3, and you ask them to show you 3, they'll pull this one up. They'll say that that's 3, but that's just the third one. So there's this developmental sequence in terms of these early skills. But what's typically been looked at is the sequence of these early skills, but not so much the development, that learning trajectory of broader domains of early math development. And so what I'm looking at in this study is how broader areas of early math develop and in what order. So one of these particularly important transitions is from early informal basic skills to more advanced formal skills. So informal skills, those are basically the ones that don't involve our formal Arabic number system. So things like connecting number words and quantities. So counting out sets, cardinal number knowledge, even story problems don't involve the formal numeral system. And so those are those more basic skills. But then we also have formal numeracy skills, and those are the ones that do involve Arabic numerals. Things like formal addition, place value, those things that start to develop towards the end of preschool and into the early elementary grades. Generally, most research has suggested that those early skills directly tie into those more advanced skills. So there's this nice little transition where those, as kids start to develop, those early skills sort of transition into those more advanced skills. But it doesn't explain that role of number knowledge. How does knowing the names of numerals and being able to connect quantities to those numerals factor into that development? So that's the goal in this study. So just to clarify, numeral knowledge, that's one, being able to name numerals, but then also connect quantities to those numerals. because the quantities are really the meaning behind numerals. We've created this arbitrary Arabic numbering system. The 3 that we see, it could, for all that really matters, we could have called that one 4, and 4 could have been 3. But the real meaning behind those numbers gets a little confusing. But the real meaning behind the numbers is the quantity. Okay? So it's also been found that difficulty in this numbering system in terms of understanding these numeral knowledge, that's actually a really strong predictor of later difficulties in math skills, even for kids who have been typically developing their earlier, more basic informal number skills. So this study was one that was published in Journal of EdPsych a couple years ago. It feels like longer than that, but I guess it was a few years ago now, using correct mathematical language. So the goal of this was to construct an empirically developed model of how these early skills develop. What I had hypothesized was that numeral knowledge would actually fully mediate that relation between informal number skills and formal skills. Basically what I mean by that is that in order for children to develop those more advanced skills, they have to map those early skills onto the numeral system, which can then be used to apply and learn that more advanced system. So for this study, we collected data on a little over 200 kids. They were generally representative of the area. They were 3 to 5, almost 6 years old the first year of the study. So in the first year, they were all in preschool, and it was in the spring of preschool. So they were a little older than when they were in the fall, because kids age, as we all do, as I've been finding out. So in the first year, I assessed the kids on informal numeracy skills, so verbal counting, one-to-one counting, cardinality, subitizing set comparison, and story problems, and then the numeral knowledge skills. So numeral identification and the set to numerals task, which is really them connecting the numerals to two quantities. So they were shown a numeral, and they were shown several different quantities. So they were shown a 3, and they were shown sets of 1, 3, 5, and 6. And we didn't say the name of the numeral, and they had to identify which one of the sets meant the same thing as the numeral. It's a more advanced version of basic numeral identification. And then in year 2, we assessed the kids on basic addition combinations, showing them, asking them to solve what 1 plus 3 was, 2 plus 3, a few combinations like that, and then the Woodcock-Johnson calculation task, which is very similar. It has a couple subtraction problems, a couple more advanced problems. Laura?
Would you take 1 second and just describe what those tasks look like under
Sure.
informal numeracy?
So the verbal counting task, that's one where we basically said, start counting at the number 1, count as high as you can. One-to-one counting, this task, what we did was we showed them a picture of, say, I think the sets were 4, 6, 10, and I think 16, or somewhere around there, sets of dots, and we asked them to count the dots. We weren't asking them how many, we were just asking them count out these dots. The next step was asking how many are in that set, and they had to reply with just saying that last number that they counted, the how many. And then the subitizing task, we quickly showed them sets of 1 to 7 in about, they saw each one for about 2 seconds and had to tell how many there were. And then the set comparison, they had 4 different sets of quantities, and they had to identify which one was the most or had the fewest. And then for the last task, story problems, we asked them basic questions like, if Johnny had 1 cookie and his mom gave him 1 more cookie, how many cookies did he have? So that was the basics for story problems. For the numeral identification task, we just showed them pictures we showed them numerals and said, what's the name of this number? And for the set to numerals task, that was, we showed them a numeral and several sets of dots, and they had to identify which set of dot was the same as the numeral. That work? Any questions on that? Okay. So to answer this question, we used some mediation analyses based off of Barron and Kenny's original mediation process, but with some recent adaptations that helped to improve it. Ultimately, what we found was our hypothesis was supported that the relation between informal and formal was fully mediated by numeral knowledge. But one of the questions that I had with this was, is one of these two aspects of numeral knowledge really driving this relation? Is one more important in terms of this mediation? Do you really just need to know the names of the numerals? Is this other task somewhat irrelevant? So what I did was we did the analyses again, but just had the one measure of each as that mediator. And ultimately what we found was that just using one of the single measures, there wasn't significant mediation. And so you did need to have both of those measures in there. Children really need to have a depth of understanding of numeral knowledge in order to be able to transition from that informal to formal numeracy knowledge. So critically, what this is really suggesting is that even if a child is developing these early skills well and on target, if they then struggle with their numeral knowledge and being able to connect that informal knowledge to that numbering system, they may then go on to struggle in that formal system. So there's this learning trajectory that we need to ensure that potentially we need to ensure that kids are getting appropriate instruction that follows that trajectory. I just said that. So now on to study 2. Sometimes I jump ahead of myself. So study 2. In terms of math development, it doesn't just develop in its own little bubble separate from everything, as much as some researchers would like to think it does. Other things affect math development. There are aspects such as the approximate number system. This is this very basic, sort of primitive discrimination ability where people can discriminate between large quantities. If I showed you a set of 100 and a set of 50 and asked you which was more, you can only see it for a couple seconds, you'd probably very easily be able to tell that the set of 100 was more. Now, if I showed you a set of 100 and a set of 75 at the same time, you'd probably still be able to do it. It might be a little bit more difficult. But then as that ratio narrows, it becomes increasingly more difficult. What's been found is that individuals who have an ability to discriminate between more narrow sets of large quantities actually seem to have higher math skills. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And we're going to talk about how and when is this related to early math development. But then also literacy skills have been shown to be related to math development. If you think about it, how many of you have heard that math is a language? A lot of people will think math is a foreign language. But it does have a really high language base. And if you think about it, a lot of what we're doing is applying names and meanings to sets and to quantities. And then in terms of print, I mean, number naming and letter naming, they have some basic underlying similarities between the two, as well as executive functioning skills. Those have been shown to be related to different aspects of math through early development. But I'm actually, for this study, mainly going to talk about these two aspects, and specifically language and not print in this study. So in terms of early development of math skills, those early and formal skills, they're also considered exact math skills. You'll hear that terminology, or verbal math skills as well. But these involve exact quantities, where you're actually identifying specific quantities, whereas the approximate number system, which is also considered a non-symbolic or non-verbal system, that's where you're really dealing with estimations or non-exact quantities. And so that's a real significant difference between these two early domains of math. And actually I already talked about this a little bit to you in terms of what it is, but one of the things that's been found with the approximate number system is there are really varying relations across studies of how it's related to early math skills. One of the things that's been found is that there may be this nonlinear relation where it's related to these more basic skills, these basic early informal skills, than it is to the more advanced skills. And so some researchers have suggested that it's really a targeted relation rather than a much broader relation towards towards all math skills. So if we take that model that we had set up in the first study, where numeral knowledge mediates the relation between informal numeracy and formal numeracy, the approximate number system really seems to primarily be related in terms of this aspect of early math development. But one of the distinctions between the approximate number system and the exact system is that the exact system is more of a verbal system. Language plays a role in that development, whereas for the approximate system, it's been shown to be a nonverbal system where language doesn't play a role. And so, there we go. Language seems to be more important in terms of this development rather than the approximate number system, which seems to be more important early on. But typically what you see in terms of early math, or in terms of how language is related to math development, most studies use these broad general measures of language, typical vocabulary measures that ask children questions such as, what is this? It's a dog. What is this? It's a house. But that in itself isn't necessarily related to math. There are actually some very specific language aspects of math that may be more related. Things like knowing terms, what does the term more mean? A lot, fewer, less, even some spatial language, near, before, after. So all of those more math language related concepts seem to be related to math more so than some of the more general math skills, or some of the more general language skills. So what this suggests is that these early approximate skills are likely to be related to math development at the earlier levels, whereas language skills are more likely to be related at the middle and later levels of development. So this gets into the second study that Jessica and I had published last, was it January or so?
First 2016 paper.
That was 2015.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think that was our first 2015 paper.
That's what it was.
Yeah, okay. So the goal of this was to identify how the approximate number system and math language were related to math development, but at which points in terms of development. So what we had hypothesized, again, was that that the approximate number system would predict low math performance, whereas math language would predict more middle and higher math performance. Yes?
Can you just define one more time what
Sure.
ANS is?
The ANS, the approximate number system, is the ability to discriminate between large quantities. The more narrow sets that you can discriminate between, the better your approximate number system. Yeah. Sure. So you have a whiteboard. I can use that. I hope I can erase that.
Yeah, you can.
So if I can reach. So you can probably pretty easily discriminate that. If I just showed you that for about 2 seconds, you'd be able to tell that this was more, okay? That gets a little tougher to do. Some people can still do that very quickly.
I did it very quickly. Congratulations.
This gets even tougher, okay? Yes?
I'm a little confused as to why that's non-verbal. Because
So-
they need those words, those vocabulary words.
It's a great question. It's an argument that I've been making with some of the people who do focus more on this. My assumption is that the transition, you do have to understand these language skills, but in terms of some of the models that have been used for assessing this, they've been able to find that pigeons and primates and other animals, even infants, can discriminate between these sets. And the way that they do it in most of those settings is with eye gaze. And so they'll stare longer at the larger set. And they've actually found relatively reliable differences across species. And so that's why it's considered more of a, what's that?
I just stared at her and said, I don't
One who can discriminate very quickly. Yeah. But one of the arguments is that the system is an evolutionarily based system. It develops out of necessity. If for animals, if you can see where there's more food, you would go there first. If you could see where there's more, or where there are more prey or predators, you would probably avoid there. It's developed as this evolutionary system, but when it connects with language, when we're able to refine that system into more exact quantities, that's one of the unique things about that exact system that we have. We can actually utilize we have this refinement process where we can then be able to identify exact sets using more verbal skills. Does that make sense? Yes.
Sorry, I'm a little slow. So the approximate number system is when you can identify between sets.
Yeah.
The difference between that and math language is when you can say one is more or less, one is near or far. Is that right?
So math language specifically is understanding the meaning of those language terms. Okay, so understanding that more, regardless of the presentation of it, that with the math language assessments, they're not timed. This is a rapid, you very quickly see this for the approximate number system. For math language, we ask more in multiple different contexts in terms of a continuous quantity and more exact quantities as well. But there's a broader level of language in terms of a lot and few, many, and things like, and some similar, equal, and all of that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yes.
So it sounds like from your evolutionary perspective, that what you were explaining, that the argument is that the child's not even attending to what that stimulus is to pick more. That you could say, pick one, and they would just intuitively pick the one that's more.
Potentially. I mean, if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, that's, well, it depends on what the more is. I mean, I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, but if you tell them to pick one, you're likely to get, you may get them to reliably just pick whichever one has more, if you just tell them to pick one. But
has anybody contrasted those two things? Just saying. Pick
no,
one.
that's a good. It's an interesting question. But if they did just automatically pick the one that's more, would that be related to math skills specifically, and not language skills, and not literacy skills? That's one of the interesting things about this approximate number system. It is distinctly related to math and not other academic early academic skills. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. This was fun. So for this study, we assessed about 114 kids, fall, spring, and preschool. They were, again, like every group of children in all of my studies, since I primarily study preschool, 3 to 5 years old. About half of them were female. They were representative of Indiana, our local area, predominantly Caucasian. And we had a range of parental education. It was a little more heavily weighted towards middle and higher parent education because I'm in a college town, and that's the population that we're able to get access to at the time. So what we did in the fall, we assessed the kids on my preschool or early numeracy skills test. That's a broad measure of early math skills. Then the Panamath, which is an online measure of the approximate number system, as well as the math language measure that I created that I'll talk about on the next slide. Then we also had a whole bunch of covariates in terms of executive functioning skills, RAN, which is a basic processing skill, as well as general vocabulary skills. And then about 5 months later in the spring, we assess them again on their general math skills. So the math language measure has 16 items. Some of the items are quantitative, and some of them are spatial language. So things like more, most, fewest, and near, below, far, and the measure was reliable in the sample. That shouldn't have happened. Okay, so in terms of the analyses that we did, rather than just doing regression simple OLS regression analyses, looking at what predicts at the mean, we were looking at what predicts at the different levels of the outcome variable. And so we used quantile regression, and Jessica was a great help in this part. So what we were looking at is how do the predictors of math change at varying levels of that math outcome? So are they different at the lowest levels and the middle levels and higher levels of spring math ability? What we found was that at that 25th percentile, at the lower end, the fall math performance was a significant predictor, as well as the approximate number system. But math language wasn't a significant predictor at those lower levels. What we found at the 50th percentile was that fall math performance was, again, a significant predictor, but math language was also a significant predictor. But the approximate number system was no longer a significant predictor. And then finally, at the 75th percentile, so at that higher end, interestingly, the only significant predictor, can you all see, was math language. It was actually, math performance wasn't a significant predictor. Math language was a very robust predictor at that higher end of math performance. So what does this mean? So first, the approximate number system, like we thought, would be a significant predictor at that lower end. And math language was a very robust predictor, but more towards the middle and the higher end. So at those basic levels of early math skills, that lowest end, the approximate number system was significant, and then that seems to refine into, it potentially has a refinement process with math language to predict more advanced skills. So now on to study 3.
Sorry, I have a question.
Sure.
So, based on study 2,
Yeah.
how do you know that children actually need to know the approximate number system? Can they just learn math language and get the same higher level results?
That's a great question, and I would probably say that the approximate number system is not as important as some may think it is. If you notice, it had a very small relation. Most of the a couple of recent meta-analyses that look at the relation of the approximate number system to math performance have generally found that overall the relation it's significant, but it's very small. And in terms of some of the intervention work, it hasn't been as clear that improving the approximate number system is actually effective at improving math skills themselves. This is partially why I'm primarily focusing on math language in the next intervention. So it was a good connection here, because I do think that I feel as though it is more math language that's at that critical aspect that we're going to look at. Laura?
I don't know how you teach the approximate number system to little kids.
Yeah, that's a good question, because there is there's several studies that what they typically do is a lot of practice, having kids try to do it rapidly, get feedback on it, and all that. The problem is that some of these studies, what they found is that through the intervention, the intervention group does, at post-test, do better than the comparison group on some general math skills, but they haven't found changes in the approximate number system. So it's not clear that it's actually improving the approximate number system, or that it's improving something else like response inhibition. So the mechanisms that it's working by need to be better untangled. Jessica?
I wanted to point out that if anybody wants to try it, I think they have this task online.
Yeah, if you go to panamath.org, you can do it.
Or your babies. Or your babies.
I don't think that, well, since you have to press the buttons with the babies, it doesn't do eye gaze. But you've done some eye tracking, right? So you could probably set it up for their babies, right? Okay, so on to study 3.
It is
Oh,
interesting
yeah.
though, like when we do our assessments with, I work with the younger age
Mhm.
group, and often many of them cannot count. If we say
Mhm.
like starting with 1, count as far as you can, and they can't answer those questions. But then there are parts of those assessments that say,
Mhm.
which has more balls, which has
Yeah.
more blocks, and they
And
generally pick the right
Mhm.
one.
And every child knows if somebody else got more than they did. Every single child. Yeah.
Right? They always know they want that piece of banana bread because it
Yeah.
has more chocolate chips.
Same with grad students too, right?
Even tying in with that, children who don't seem to score as well on the assessments that have built upon that
Mhm.
comparison. We have a lot of children that can do that with flying colors, and they may not really have any other math skills, but
Mhm.
that odds upon entering is
Yeah.
something we can.
Yeah, it's interesting. Any other questions before I move on? No? Okay. Was that a hand, Laura? No? Okay. All right. So we know that math language is one of the strongest, if not the strongest predictor of early math skills, at least from the previous study and a couple other studies compared to other skills in terms of predicting math over the preschool year. We also know that higher levels of parent math talk with their kids and higher levels of teacher math talk with their students is related to growth over time in children's early math skills. We also know that children from low SES families, they typically score significantly lower in terms of their math language than kids from middle and higher SES families. And that basically maps onto achievement gaps with math and general language skills as well. But all of the evidence in terms of how math language is related to math performance is correlational in nature. We don't know if there's actually a causal relation. Does improving math language also improve math performance? So that's what we're addressing here. This was a study that we completed last spring, and I'm waiting any day now to get the final acceptance from the journal. Hopefully it comes soon. We just sent in some minor revisions. Yes, Jacqueline. Journal of Research on Educational Effectiveness. It hasn't officially been accepted, so they can still reject it, but hopefully. This was one that I worked on with 3 of my grad students. They really did a fantastic job. When you have good grad students working with you, it really makes your life so much better. So the goal of this study, it was sort of 2 parts. First, it was to evaluate the causal relation between math language and numeracy skills. And the second part was also to see, is using a storybook reading intervention a feasible mechanism for teaching math language in preschool? So I hypothesized that yes, for both of those, that there is a causal relation and that it would be feasible for teaching math language in preschool. For this study, what we did was we had 47 Head Start kids who were randomly assigned to the intervention group or business as usual comparison group. The business as usual comparison group just did what they would normally do. They didn't get pulled for any sessions. They were 3 to 5. This was a more diverse sample, about a third Caucasian, third Hispanic, about 13% African American, and about 25% that were other or didn't report. And then parent education, it was a lower parent education sample because it was from Head Start. So we pre-tested them during the fall on the PENS measure, the math language measure, and the expressive one-word vocabulary test. It's a general measure of vocabulary skills. And then at the start of the spring semester, we randomly assigned kids to the intervention, which went for 8 weeks. And then after those 8 weeks, then we had our spring break, and then we had their spring break, and then we post-tested them. The fun things with doing research in schools. So for the intervention, for that math language intervention, it was we had 15-minute sessions, 2 to 3 days a week. The goal was 3 days a week, but as you all know, in the winter, we have this thing called snow. And we had a lot of snow days that year. We even had some fog days. So on average, kids had 14 and a half total sessions. So it was about 2 to 3 per week. And then The interventionists, what they did was they would read to a group of 2 or 3 kids at a time, and there were 6 different books. Some of them were more focused on quantitative language, and some of them were more focused on spatial language. But when we had opportunities to integrate questions from either area into a book, we did that. So the first 6 weeks, each had a different book, where they would read one book 2 or 3 times in 1 week, then the next book 2 or 3 times, et cetera, until we got to the 6th week. And the 7th and 8th week, those weeks were makeup sessions, as well as letting the kids pick whichever book that they wanted if they had reached the maximum number of sessions. So the storybook reading context that we used, we built it off of dialogic reading. Basically, the first reading, the kids were primarily read the book with, and they were asked some very basic prompts, some completion prompts, some open-ended questions. And then as they went through the readings the second and third time, they were asked more advanced and more complex questions. So these questions generally followed the peer and crowd format. So crowd stands for completion prompts, recall prompts where they were asked about something that happened either earlier or happened in the story the last time that they read it. O are open-ended questions. W are who, what, where, when, why questions. A lot of those overlap with the open-ended questions, but if you didn't have the W, it would be crod, and that doesn't really sound all that good. And D is distancing, so asking the children to questions that connect the story to their lives. What we found was, first off, at post-test, there was a significant difference in math language performance. The intervention group significantly outperformed the comparison group on math language. And the same thing for math performance. So even though there wasn't any numeracy content in the interventions, they did significantly improve their numeracy performance. So this suggests that math language is potentially causally related to numeracy performance. And then also a dialogic reading intervention styled like this can be a useful tool, can potentially be a useful tool for improving math language in a preschool classroom. We do have to do some scale up to working with teachers, and potentially we want to translate this to working with parents to see if they can also do this for an intervention. So, general conclusions from across these 3 studies. Does anybody have any questions about that one before I move on? Is there anything I can make more clear? No. Yes, Jacqueline.
This is a question.
Sure.
Is that study still going on? Is there like
No, so we finished that one a year ago and have just been going through the review process right now, and are asking funding agencies to fund us for the scale up. So Jessica actually is on a proposal that we're waiting to hear back from for scaling it up to classrooms. And then, yes?
David, are you saying that in your results you found an improvement in kids on math language?
Yes.
You also saw an improvement in numeracy?
Yes.
Just those 2 outcomes?
Yes, not on general vocabulary.
And numeracy, remind me again, is tell me which number, like I pulled up the digit that says 3.
Yeah, it's the PENS measure, which has
right.
naming numerals, it has counting, things like that.
But it's not more or less. It's not the same skill.
There are a couple exact comparison skills where they have to identify which of these is the most, but they're more narrow targeted questions. And those.
5 more than 3.
Well, it's like 1, 3, 7, and 8. So they have to really have those exact number skills to differentiate between those.
Are there other examples of studies that have tried to improve math language using other approaches?
So there are 3 other studies that have targeted math language. 2 of them, or one of them is at kindergarten level, or actually, so 4 studies. One is a single experiment design with repeated baseline design with a few different parents. They were really just trying to target, can parents elicit more math language from their kids through some reading. There's one that was done by Brenna Hassinger-Das that just came out in Elementary School Journal with kindergarten kids, but that was combined with the math language intervention was on top of a math intervention, a number sense intervention. And then there were two others that also did the same thing, where the math language was on top of a math intervention, and so you can't separate out the effects of the math intervention from the math language intervention. Yes?
Did the control group, I was trying to remember the graphs now, did they improve at all? Like it looked at one of the graphs, it looked like they hardly improved from pre-test to post-test.
For math, no. There was no significant improvement across the year, which they're using creative curriculum in those schools, which is, according to the What Works Clearinghouse, has no discernible effects on math. And so, but yeah, there was no change in math skills from across those about 4 or 5 months for the comparison group. Yes?
I was thinking about the books that you chose, and when you
Yeah.
started talking, I thought maybe you created your own, but it looks
Yeah.
like you actually had some. So how did you control for amount of math language exposure in the books themselves?
So since all the kids in the intervention group got the same number of same books and everything, the kids in the comparison group got nothing. So that's the comparison that's being made. We didn't balance between specific math words or anything like that. But that's one of the things that so part of these proposals that we have under review right now include designing our own books. Because finding those 6 books was one of the most challenging things I have ever done. We looked through thousands of books, and there are so few that have good use of math language in them. We found 6 that were adequate. A couple of them were better than the others, but and kids seemed to be engaged with those ones. But there were others that did have a lot of the math language, but just weren't as engaging. Lori?
What Kieran's getting at is, it might just be exposure to the content of the book that's improving math language and not the conversations.
Yeah. Well,
Since the control group who wasn't read these books at all.
right. Well, it was that what you're.
That would be a follow-up.
Yeah. I mean, we do need to see the books themselves didn't have any numeracy content in them. It was just the language content. But I mean, when you're comparing, yes, they got this math language content. It might not have been the discussion about it. It might have just been hearing this language. But we did feel as though that is something to test of, does it need to be in a dialogic reading context? So that is an interesting question. Yes?
This may be a silly question, but I'm wondering if the language of instruction matters. We have some ELL students here, and I'm just wondering if learning the quantities, like in Spanish, for example, translates when you're learning math that the teachers instructing in English.
That's a fascinating question that I would love to actually have an answer to. But there's been very, very little research in terms of math with English language learners at the preschool age, and it's an area that there needs to be a lot more. And I think it's one that, given the high language level in math, that is a particularly important area to do research in. It's a challenge for me right now because we don't have really any English language learner populations within 45 minutes to an hour of us. We have a very small population near us, but not enough to consistently engage in research. Any other questions before I move on? Yes? Mhm. So 3 of the books focused on more that quantitative language. Most, a lot, few, and 3 of the books focused more on that spatial language, near, before, after, close. And so we had that broad range of language that was included. But when I looked a little bit more deeply into the assessments of quantitative and spatial language, it seemed as though most of the improvement was in quantitative language and not on spatial. And so that's likely what was driving that change in numeracy performance. Okay, so I'll quickly go through some general conclusions. First, math development is actually really complicated. It's not just this broad concept called math. There are these very specific aspects that develop in this really important order, and this developmental process happens very quickly over the preschool years. I mean, you basically starting at the beginning of preschool, you'll have some kids who can't even do verbal counting, and they go from those 2 years from not being able to do really anything like that to being potentially able to do some addition and subtraction. That's a very rapid development of these skills. Imagine learning calculus in a year. Many of you took calculus. Some of you now? Okay, a few of you. And it's really complex for these kids. Learning to count is a very complex process, but it happens quite rapidly at these early years. Likely, we need to use some more targeted assessments in terms of identifying children at risk, in terms of identifying how these skills develop as well. So, in terms of identification of risk, we may need to go more than just using cutoff criterion on a broad measure of math. We may need to use other non-math measures, things like math language or executive functioning skills to help us enhance our risk status prediction. Another future direction, I talked about this a little bit, is scaling up these interventions for the classroom use to see can they be reliably done in classrooms by teachers and still generate the same effects, as well as by parents. I mean, the home environment is often, hopefully, a child's first learning environment, but parents really do very little in terms of early math in the home. And so, can this be something that can be translated there? Because parents do read to their kids, and so if they can, this intervention can be translated for home use, we might have an opportunity to really affect change of early math skills. And then, so I kind of touched on that too, but finally, the cross-language stability. I finished a study recently collecting some similar data to that second study that I talked about in China. And so, is the importance of math language, is that stable across languages, or is it something that has to do more, is the importance of it, does that have to do more with the way that the English language is structured? And if you think about our counting system, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Those numbers make no sense why they're named like that, versus the Chinese naming system, which gets up to 10, 10, 1, 10, 2, 10, 3, a much more structured and reasonable counting system. And so, is math language more important in English than it is in other languages? So thank you to everybody that worked with me. Jessica, you're on there. And the grant, or the IES funded parts of the first and second, and then hard work of my grad students and undergrads for the third study. Thank you. Any questions? And that's my son again. My other son gets no pictures right now. I have to get pictures of him.
David, if we wanted to use some of those books just for fun, could you recommend them to us?
Albert's Bigger Than Big Idea by Eleanor May. It's probably, of the books that we found, that's probably the best one. And then also, How Many is Many? I can't remember the author on that one. And then, I can't remember the other names off the top of my, but those two were probably the best ones. Albert's Bigger Than Big Idea. There's a whole series of these mouse math books that are really good that I liked a lot and have bought for my son too. Other questions? You asked a lot. While
I know we did.
Which was good. No, I said I'm used to being interrupted, so it's good. Yes.
I'll just say I like the pen speed.
Thank
I
you.
use it a lot.
Thank you.
What works is.
Great. That makes me happy.
Yeah, she'd be happy to try it out with books with some parents,
Yes.
right?
Okay. Well, I'm applying for funding right now, and so I might be in touch with y'all about, yeah. Anything else? No? Well, thank you.